but I can already introduce our next moderator, Alice Chan. Alice is the head of industry relations at the German-Chinese Association of Artificial Intelligence, and is responsible for the exchange between Europe and Asia for AI professionals. She will be moderating the next panel, and I hand it over to you, Alice, to introduce the speakers. And
yeah, thank you, Sid. Yeah, it's my 4th year with Asia Berlin Summit, definitely my favorite summit of the year, and really happy to be here physically with everyone again. And yeah, today is an investor day. There are lots of discussion about VC investors, startups, and so on around this circle. But corporate innovation is actually also a very big topic that actually most of the corporate are spending lots of money in. So today I'm very happy to have our panelists who come from different perspectives, from corporate, from entrepreneur, and also from VC perspective to talk about this topic. So first, I would like to introduce our first panelist, Varun, who is a CEO of Paytm Money. Thank you, Varun. And Varun just like come from, yeah, wherever you like. You just come from India like yesterday, right? Long flight for this event. So really happy to have you here. Thanks a lot. And then our second panelist, Luis. He is a senior investment and asset manager from InnoEnergy. Hi. And then, yeah, Marcus. He is a head of Innovation Center Network, Berlin Potsdam from SAP. Welcome, Marcus. Thank you. Yeah, please have a seat. Okay, so as a start, maybe we just start from a quick intro about what's your background and what's your impression about corporate innovation. So let's start with SAP.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. My background is I come from SAP. I had the Innovation Center here in Berlin, Potsdam, and I'm part of a larger organization called New Ventures in Technology, which at SAP is responsible for envisioning and then also building the next generation of enterprise applications. And I have a background, a long history with innovation, and especially entrepreneurship and corporate venturing at SAP. So in 2014, I've been working with a bunch of startups a couple of years back, and actually Louis and I have been in touch in that context. I was thinking that actually SAP's innovation model necessarily wasn't the best model for innovating specifically in new markets and new product categories. And I was very inspired by the work that I saw in the startup world. You know, I was seeing all of those entrepreneurs in the Berlin ecosystem that I was working with approach the same types of problems that we were trying to approach in our innovation programs in a very different way. And I was actually inspired to bring that into SAP. And so we actually started very small back in 2014. Entrepreneurship wasn't such a big thing at the time, and we experimented and we tried to bring the methodology, the mindset, the funding mechanisms, on all these types of things into SAP, trying to stick as closely to that model as possible to preserve what had been proven to work in the entrepreneurship world. Into SAP, and it worked very well. And over time, it actually evolved quite significantly at SAP. New Ventures in Technology is now like a more than 400 people organization at SAP that combines different aspects of innovation, including the innovation centers, one of which I'm leading, which is more tech-driven. We have the venture studio, which allows employees to develop corporate ventures. We have the Fund and Foundry, which works with external startups. And it's really interesting to bring all of these facets of corporate innovation together to really get the best out of them in that combined perspective.
Thank you, Luis.
Okay. So hello, everyone. My name is Luis from InnoEnergy. Actually, I started my career in the world of the innovation centers of a big corporate, which is the Deutsche Telekom, Germany's biggest telecommunication operator, in the so-called T-Labs. Back then, afterwards, I built up 2 companies myself, one non-scaling one, consulting, mainly in the automotive sector, and afterwards a more scaling one, which is Mappergy, and with an artificial intelligence tech stack. Also become a non-professional business angel, and 3 years ago, I started working at InnoEnergy in order to have a closer look through the perspective of an investor. And when it comes to corporate innovation, of course, the no-brainer answer first is it's a necessity to stay alive as a company. What you can then also differentiate are, let's say, very simply speaking, two main ways of innovation. One is the incremental one, where I would say that's the standard for innovate step by step, very close related to your core business and also your existing products. And the other is, of course, when it comes to disruptive innovation, mainly where you are active. You said already there's different skill set is needed. For instance, it's also very hard for incumbent players to do that, because this normally means you have to spend a lot of money in a very uncertain future with an uncertain outcome, as well as, not always, but most of the time also cannibalizing your existing core business, which makes it very, very hard. And therefore, for this second way, this disruptive innovations way, you need normally different tools next to this, let's say, corporate R&D units you normally have for your core business and the incremental innovation. And definitely one tool is having innovation centers. Most of the time, they're as independent as possible from the core business. For instance, I mean, structuring-wise, as well as location-wise. For instance, the Deutsche Telekom laboratories, where I used to work, are set up in Berlin, whereas the headquarters of Deutsche Telekom is in Bonn. I don't know whether that was also one point for your innovation center to be built here, not back at the headquarters of SAP, but that's definitely one way to go. And the other way, which is at least in the German or European world a bit newer, is this tool of an intrapreneur. Of course, most of the time there are interdependencies, or they're also located maybe in innovation centers, but innovation centers separated from the core business, as well as intrapreneurs. These are the two most important tools, I think, for disruptive technologies within the incumbent company.
Should I go? Yes, please. You able to hear me well? I don't think this is working. Yeah. Cool. Hey, first of all, happy to be here. I had a long flight, and I was thinking when they invited me for corporate innovation, I'm the wrong guy. Right? I personally believe it's complete nonsense. It doesn't work. Right? And I'll talk about it in a bit. I left that world. And I kind of, so I work with a company called Paytm Money, right? I don't know how many of you know Paytm. It's India's largest payment company now. We call it India's largest startup. We're going for market listing very soon. So, we have about 500 million odd customers, right? And we do about 1.5 billion transactions. It started a while back in a small room, 100 square feet room. Today it's a company with, valuations in excess of $20 billion. It's doing very well. It's still not profitable. Right, and it's a typical startup that's gone on to become what you would call a unicorn way back, right? And if I rewind myself a bit, I used to work for BNP Paribas, large bank, and I did 8 years there. My first startup was Deutsche Bank, complete disaster, right? Because they came to India, and I still remember there's a very nice guy. We worked very hard to explain India to this person, and he came in and he said it was not to blame him. It was his first 24 hours in a foreign country. And Deutsche Bank had to expand, right? So imagine first 24 hours, you go into a country like India, and you have to take a decision on is this the right thing to do. Very senior guy, right? Great brains, had all the right tick marks. But you come into India, and you set up a startup. I worked there for a couple of years. Eventually, I lost vision, right? And I said, what am I doing here? I was fairly back. I was young then. I had much more hair. Times have changed. Things have changed now. Where I am today, I think I worked 8 years. In 2019, somehow, China hit me somewhere in 2013, 2014. So I was launching a bank there, a digital bank, and I realized that, Jack Ma had completely got it right? I don't know how many of you ever experienced China with this product called Wuibao, which is a 1 yuan mutual fund, right? And, 600 million Chinese have mutual funds. Just think about it for a second, right? And, completely 7-8 years later, Chinese wealth management, et cetera, changed, right? And I could see BNP Paribas launching a digital bank. We'd called it Hello Bank. In Germany, it's called Consorsbank. But we had launched a digital bank in China. We had called it Hi Bank, right? And the bank Nihao. And we'd got 1 million customers and we were celebrating. And I was like, dude, those guys have got 100 million and we are at 1 million. And we're opening champagne bottles. The cost of champagne is more than the revenue the customers made. And, they called it a great corporate innovation example. But somewhere, I was young in BNP, whatever, enjoying the European life. And I went on. And then eventually I landed in India, where I realized that India was changing rapidly. Like all these corporates, and I could clearly see China, the startups, the vibe there. And then I went to San Francisco for something called the Learning Expedition, something like this. And that's one of the reasons I come here. And I was shocked to see how San Francisco is changing. It was 2015, right? And 5 days there, I knew I was in the wrong place, right? It took me a couple of years to get back to India and find my own and eventually start. So I went and joined a company called Oppo, OnePlus, Realme, these are all phone brands, Vivo. So I joined them, and I had just to give you a sense of entrepreneurship and why I don't believe in corporate innovation anymore, because I think it was 6 p.m., the founder of OnePlus, he was explaining the financial services vision in China, and I told him I don't agree, right? At 6 p.m., I realized to a Chinese boss, you never say that, because we were in his office till 9 a.m. the next day, arguing on what's right, but a fantastic guy, so passionate, real, honest, truthful about everything, right? And when I eventually joined Paytm, I decided to take a big salary cut, right? So I hardly get salary anymore. So if I have to live off salaried stuff, right? And I think one of the reasons I don't believe in corporate innovation per se is the merits, the incentives of truly being a startup is not there. Like how many corporate innovation programs or heads of those programs actually make $20 million, right? And I think that's the question to ask. So yeah, so I've had a fantastic time. Good seeing you yesterday. I attended a few events, but as we go along, happy to answer a few questions.
Thank you, thank you. So it's really interesting to hear. Like I feel some smoke here. And yeah, I also come from corporate innovation unit, and also like to confirm your points. Actually, like there are all the big German corporate you can think of. There's a lab in Berlin. But what does those labs like really working on? So maybe as a SAP, it's a very good example. Like there's lots of like SAP ecosystem. I also see something in Hackerschaftsmarkt and Potsdam and so on. So maybe you can give us some hints about what is a SAP like corporate innovation ecosystem, and how do you work with startups?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, I think the answer to this is multifaceted, and I wish somebody told me that you would take that position before, and so I could have been better prepared. But I think you're right. I would agree that I think the corporate world, if you were thinking about the type of entrepreneurship that can happen inside of a company, is certainly different than what happens outside for various reasons. There are structural boundaries. There's talent to access. There are different mindsets that entrepreneurs outside the company have than inside, and there's different incentive mechanisms that speak to different people. And so I think we definitely believe that you need to have a multifaceted answer, and that's what we've been trying to build from the very beginning. And so we definitely have the fund in foundries as one of those facets. So we're running foundry programs where we work with early stage startups all over the globe. So in San Francisco, in Shanghai, and in Bangalore, and Tel Aviv, and like all the places that you need to be in order to identify the startups we want to work with on a number of different levels at an early stage. Think about partners, thinking about acquisitions, and really learning about certain areas that are really interesting for SAP, and that will be difficult to learn about if you're doing that from within SAP. And we also have a fund which does early stage investments, and we have truly early stage investments, as we've heard before. And we have Sapphire Ventures, which is an SAP subsidiary that does later stage investments, and all of those different teams work together very closely to really monitor, survey, and collaborate with the external startup market. So that's one piece of it. But obviously, as a company like SAP, you don't only want to rely on inorganic growth and acquisitions and working with partners. There are some disruptive threats that, as a company, you need to get ahead of yourself and really understand, how are we going to develop long-term? How do we develop new business models? How do we develop new products and services? And we found, as I mentioned before, that sort of the traditional corporate model for innovating in a traditional R&D department doesn't necessarily work for various reasons. And there are many things you can learn from how startups approach things, from testing things in the market early on with the right teams, with the right mindset, with the right governance, that can really help you with getting the most out of your R&D efforts that you're putting into various spaces. And then, as Louis rightly mentioned, we established the Innovation Center and also our corporate venturing programs outside of the SAP ecosystem so that we could be more independently. And I think it would definitely be interesting at a later point in time to maybe touch base on how important is it to stay far enough away so you can do the things that nobody else would be doing, but also stay close enough so that whatever you're doing doesn't necessarily end up in the garbage bin because it's not connected to the corporate goals and really to the corporate agenda. So it's really good to find that right distance between the corporate and the innovation arm. And so on the internal innovation side, we again have two different types of teams. One is the Venture Studio, which is really essentially a place where SAP employees can develop new ways and pursue new ideas and pursue them in an entrepreneurial way. As mentioned, we're trying to put the same governance in place. So we have advisory boards, we have incentives for entrepreneurs that basically scale. So they're acquiring virtual capital and virtual stake in the companies that they're building, and they're being incentivized based on that. And so we've put a number of things in place to really give those teams the freedom and the right incentives to grow those models in new ways. And the types of ventures that we're pursuing are primarily focused on, I would say, commercial innovation, new markets that we're addressing, where there's not too much technical risk in those types of topics. And I was actually a general manager for one of those ventures, so I've also directly experienced that perspective. And I can definitely say that some of the companies, and Varun and I had this discussion beforehand, there are definitely some challenges that break the traditional entrepreneurship model inside of a corporate, and where you're just hitting certain boundaries that are difficult to overcome. Still, I would say, based on the experience I had, it's a vastly superior model for pursuing certain types of ideas within a company as opposed to in the traditional model. And then the last piece of our innovation equation is the Innovation Center, which I'm heading. And this is basically a playing ground for teams that are pursuing specifically new technology, which doesn't mean necessarily that we're a primarily technology-driven team. We do work backwards from the customer problem, but we try to apply this, essentially, we're trying to work backwards from the customer problems and apply first principles thinking, asking not necessarily like what's the incremental way of taking this idea forward to the next step, but really, how do new technologies such as blockchain, DeFi, AI, et cetera, enable us to solve those problems in completely new ways? And that's what we're trying to do. And in an ideal world, like all of those things in a company play together so they can mutually enrich themselves. So we've actually seen that many of the things that started in an innovation center, and often like in a very inconspicuous way, you would look at that problem and say, why are we doing this? Really not that interesting. We don't really see necessarily a path to the big money, but over time it developed into something that ultimately made its way into the ventures, which then allowed us to scale those efforts, experiment in the market early on, learn about how to do this right, and then ultimately transition those into our products. And we have a couple of really good examples where that really worked out well for SAP. One is in the area of business process intelligence, where essentially something that we started very early at an innovation center developed into something that we've now complemented with the acquisition of Signavio to really build a new foundation of business process intelligence for SAP. And another one is in the area of low-code, no-code development, where again we've seen something come out of the Innovation Center and transition through the Venture Studio into like a core SAP product.
Thank you. So yeah, that's very impressive to see there are so many different innovative initiatives within SAP. I see most of corporate people, they just stay as a stakeholder role, but you have very interesting experience as a general manager of one of the ventures. So that's basically like different interests. So I'm very curious about like what do you see from, since you were in both sides, what's the differences and what's a success factor to work with the corporate?
So I would say, so I was a general manager in a corporate venture, so I was inside. I did have a small startup back in 2000, which like is a totally different experience. But what I will say is that, and again, Varun and I talked about this earlier. So we were trying to build a venture where we were trying to provide employees in the US early access to their earnings. So instead of paying them at payday, we wanted to go in and allow them to get an advance on their paycheck. And one of the issues we ran into was that in the US and also in some other geographies, it's unclear how this should be treated from a regulatory perspective. So it's unclear whether that actually constitutes a wage payment or not. And depending on whether it is considered a wage payment or not, different taxing rules apply. And so if you're a startup, and we've seen many of the startups in the space do exactly that, they would just put money in the bank and then start paying people and not worry about all of the regulatory overhead. I guess many of them wouldn't even necessarily know about it. And so they have a lot of freedom in how to deal with that. But in an SAP perspective, obviously, since we're a large company, you can't just put money in the bank and start paying people, because that touches a number of different regulations, from payment processing to payday lending, since SAP doesn't necessarily have a lending license, to this tax issue that we identified. So actually, we had to go in and build a much more complicated product. And we actually needed to get clarity on the regulatory status of this particular problem we wanted to solve. And the unfortunate thing is we couldn't get to clarity. And so any startup would have continued to run in this business. But for SAP, the question was, can we really afford to develop a product where we can't really tell our customers whether they will be compliant if they're using it or not? And that turned out to be a big issue for SAP. So definitely there are some limitations. And I think the conclusion that we made based on this one is that for this particular topic, it's probably better to work with external startups. So we actually pivoted on the strategy, and we're now partnering with external startups in the space. And so I guess the answer to which ideas to pursue and through which avenue is one that can be very nuanced and needs to be taken with a lot of care. And there are definitely boundaries where you're running into those types of issues, but there are also great topics that can be significantly accelerated through the scale and the assets that you have in a corporate.
Thank you. So yeah, I think there are lots of corporate innovation initiatives contribute to the sustainability. And nowadays, like ESG, environmental, social, and corporate governance and sustainability become one of the most important topics. So I would like to ask Luis, since you are a VC in the energy sector, is it part of your selection criteria? And if so, how would you ensure or encourage the ventures adopt in their governance?
Yes, exactly. Because what I forgot is to tell you a bit more about InnoEnergy. Because we are not a big corporate and we are just not just an innovation unit. We're actually also a strange animal. We are a public-private partnership, doing investments in sustainable energy and mobility, mainly across Europe, but also in the whole world. And therefore, of course, we're looking, because we have that in our investment thesis, like the sustainability, we look from the very beginning into this topic when we make the decision to invest or not. Of course, you have these classic, nowadays classic. I mean, we started with that 10 years ago, I have to say. But nowadays, of course, one no-brainer is their CO2 impact, and other related measures and KPIs, as well as, for instance, diversity, also very important. Background-wise, of course, also female, male, especially in the entrepreneurs world, not only there, but very much there. We have, I don't know, I think around 80 or even above % of male entrepreneurs. Even more severe, that problem, I see it as a problem in the energy and mobility world. There are definitely other areas where it's maybe a bit better. So these kind of, let's say, extraordinary points we focus on when we make a decision, next to classic ones like what's the business return for us, for instance, and whether it fits to our strategy. And coming back to your second question, how we make sure that we implement this, via governance or whatever for our startups. Normally, we don't have to, because also by definition, the entrepreneurs we are working with or we want to work with start with this mindset of wanting to have a sustainable impact next to a financial one. So by definition, that's in their mindset and trickle down to their strategy, activities, and so on and so forth. So there is no big need to, let's say, lure them in the direction of sustainability, measurement, governance, or whatever.
It's my turn.
Pardon?
It's my turn now.
I can tell, no, of course.
Thank you. I know you all can talk until the night, but yes. Yeah, but the next question will come to Varun. So because we do corporate innovation, we do sustainability with like social responsibility, but one of the most important part is to gain revenue, to gain profit. And as a banker, from banker to fintech, you have a strong connection between India and Europe. So, and also nowadays, emerging markets such as India and other Asian countries have been very popular to enter. So from your experience, how should Indian and European entrepreneurs partner together to enter emerging market and gain profit?
I think Europe has a lot to offer. One of the reasons I think German companies, there are a few of them who are doing extremely well in India. I was mentioning, if you look at Bosch and Siemens, I think fantastic job understanding India, getting the local model right. At the same time, on the opposite end, their companies have got it horribly wrong, right? But I think how do you, at a startup, we often talk about, let's take the example of Paytm, right? We have what we call it as the moat of the business, right? And there's a moat, and we say, what's the reason why a consumer will keep coming back to you every day, every hour, and so on and so forth. So we do about 1.5 billion transactions at a 99.9% accuracy, and our moat is considered payments, right? So we say, okay, how do you make sure that any payment use case is solved, right? And then along the moat, because if you don't preserve your moat, eventually competition will eat you, right? And then you have to ask yourself, how do you preserve your moat? Like I think European companies do a great job preserving moat because of either history, regulation, infrastructure, but we forget more often than not, there's an ecosystem behind. Right? So for example, in the payment business in India, we have about 22 million merchants and we have about 500 million odd consumers. Right? Now you combine both and you have a fantastic moat. And I'll give you an example. In India now, very recently in the last couple of years, something called FASTag has come up. FASTag is nothing but you go on the Autobahn and the tax on your car gets auto-debited. Right? Fairly simple. But in India, in a country like that with infrastructure, which is not European standard, to execute that is a tremendous story. Right? So till about 2 years back, we were not in that business, right? 2.5 years back. Then one day, the founder of the company is a man called Vijay. He came up and said, I find it really sad that Indians, when they cross the toll, there's always fighting, you have to give change, and a bunch of people, traffic, pollution, cars, and all of that. And then the government was running a project called FASTag. What we did is we incentivized a certain internal team, a bunch of people who we said, who wants to own FASTag? And the way it works in Paytm is if you don't put your hand up, nobody gives you a business, right? It's not forced on you. But if you put your hand up, you have a significant chance of monetization, you have a significant chance of career growth and all of that naturally. It's like another startup. So a bunch of people put their hand up and they got going into this FASTag thing. Today, I'll give you some statistics. We are about 53% market share in India, right? Both on the acquiring side, which means anytime you cross a toll booth, we've done an installation, and both on the consumer side. That translates to about 100 million transactions, right? And that's not small. Right, and that's very, very important, and the amount of petrol, et cetera, that's saved is immense. Now, that's the moat. If I don't preserve the moat, there's no question of what we would call monetization and cross-selling or upselling, if you may. Right, so I'm part of a company called Paytm Money, which essentially does stock broking. So you could consider me, stock broking, derivatives, et cetera, et cetera. We launched a small project called Digital Gold about 3 years back, right? And that's how you monetize. So you say, okay, consumers are coming to my shopping mall. So imagine Paytm is one app where 500 million Indians turn up every day, right? Now, what else can you sell to them is the question with ease. So we launched this product called Digital Gold. I don't know how many of you know, but all Indians have gold, right? All over. You can, empty an Indian pocket and you'll find some gold coming out from somewhere, right? Or a home, right? So we all have gold. And somebody, 3 years back, we said, hey, let's digitize it. And everybody laughed at us and said, how can you digitize gold? people buy gold to wear a jewelry or something. So he said, no, why don't we try it? So what we did is we got gold from 1 rupee to about 150,000 euros. You could buy it online on your app. It's purely digital. It takes a click. Prices are real time, so you don't need to go to a jeweler. Quality is, is 24 carats, so you can get it back. Today we have 62 million consumers doing digital gold with us, right? And we've transacted about 6,000 kilos of gold in the last 18 months. And last Diwali, so Diwali is Christmas for us in India, we were bigger than the largest Indian jeweler, right? And my cost of running that is 6 people. Okay, so just think about the maths behind a business model like that, and that's what we would call monetization. Now, what typically ends up happening is you need to choose till when do you pursue your moat. I think in Europe, yesterday I was listening to the pitch that people were making, and typically I judge those events in India or in Singapore or in China. What I notice is you talk to a startup founder, he has no clue of his business plan. Right? What he can tell you is 5 years out, I'll have 50 million consumers. I will think of monetization a bit later, right? Whereas in Europe, I was surprised to see somebody looking for funding for 60,000 euros and saying in 6 months, I'll make you money, right? Like I think in India, in San Francisco, that expectation is not there. The expectation is you'd build a moat so solid that for anybody else to come and break it is difficult. And once you've built a moat, monetization, and if you look at the Amazon model, it's that. For years together, everybody criticized Bezos, saying, hey, he doesn't know how to make money, right? And today, criticism is gone when he has billions behind him, right? And I think that's the challenge. Until when do you go on with a moat? And where do you stop and say, hey, I need to monetize, right? If you monetize too early, you have a small business which won't last because a bigger company with corporate innovation will come and buy you out, right? Or money will work, or capital arbitrage is so huge. So I think you have to choose. When does your moat finish? When do you start monetizing? At which stage do you feel comfortable that I will have a surviving business? Yeah. So, but I think the question is, how much do you want to make, and how can you make sure that the society benefits from it? I think if you don't get those two things right, eventually profit alone, has no purpose.
Thank you. Do we still have more time? Cool. So I think we have some time to take 1 or 2 questions if there's any from the audience. Take a chance. Well, yes, please.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so first of all, I'm really excited to see you here sitting in front of me. I'm from India, living in Berlin. And Paytm is, as he already mentioned,